Imagine a Europe where a third of the population has vanished from the face of the earth, where thriving cities have been reduced to ruins, and fertile fields have been overgrown by forests. This is not apocalyptic fiction. It is the reality of Germany after the 30 Years' War. The conflict, which began with two officials being thrown out of a window of Prague Castle, turned into the bloodiest catastrophe in the history of Central Europe. 30 years of continuous fighting from 1618 to 1648 claimed the lives of 8 million people. Entire regions were depopulated forever, and some have not regained their pre-war population even after 300 years. Today, we will tell you the story of a war that forever changed the face of Europe and showed what religious intolerance and the political ambitions of great powers can lead to. Subscribe to our channel to learn more about the most dramatic events in European history, and in the comments, share your opinion. Could the 30 Years' War have been prevented if European rulers had shown more wisdom and tolerance? Or did the religious conflicts of the time make the conflict inevitable? The 23rd of May, 1618, changed the fate of Europe forever. In Prague Castle, enraged Protestant nobles stormed the royal palace, seized 2 Catholic viceroys of the emperor, and threw them out of a third-floor window. The fall from a height of 20 meters should have been fatal, but fate decided otherwise. Willem Slavata and Jaroslav Martinek landed in a manure heap and survived with only minor injuries. Catholics immediately declared this a miracle of God, proof of the righteousness of their faith. Protestants, on the other hand, claimed that the devil had saved his minions from their deserved punishment. This story of officials being thrown out of a window, absurd at first glance, became the spark that ignited the entire European continent. The Second Defenestration of Prague, as historians called this event, marked the beginning of the bloodiest and most destructive war in German history. But behind this dramatic episode lay deep contradictions that had been building up for decades. The Holy Roman Empire of the German nation was a patchwork quilt of 350 independent states, principalities, duchies, and free cities. Each of them jealously guarded its independence, and the religious schism that began with Martin Luther's speech a century earlier turned the empire into a powder keg. The Augsburg Religious Peace of 1555 established the principle of whose power, that faith, allowing princes to independently determine the religion of their subjects. It seemed that a compromise had been found, but in reality, it only froze the conflict. The Catholic League, led by the Bavarian Duke Maximilian, opposed the Protestant Union, led by the Palatinate elector Frederick V. The two military political groups were just waiting for a reason to engage in a deadly battle. The empire was racked by religious intolerance. In Cologne, Catholics expelled Protestant merchants, while in Hamburg, Lutherans barred Catholics from holding city offices. Mixed marriages became rare, and children often renounced parents who had adopted the heretical faith. Preachers on both sides called for a holy war against apostates from the true faith, and pamphlets full of mutual accusations were distributed in thousands of copies. Economic interests became intertwined with religious passions. The Catholic Church owned vast landholdings in Protestant regions that had been secularized after the Reformation. The Pope demanded their return, while Protestant princes categorically refused to part with their lucrative possessions. Trade routes connecting the north and south of the empire passed through lands of different faiths, which created constant conflicts. The international situation also inflamed passions. Catholic Spain supported its co-religionists in an effort to maintain its hegemony in Europe. The Protestant powers, England, Holland, and Denmark, sought ways to weaken the power of the Habsburgs. France, formerly Catholic, secretly supported the Protestants, following the principle of "the enemy of my enemy is my friend." Europe was turning into a giant chessboard, where every move could lead to war. The election of Ferdinand of Styria as Holy Roman Emperor was the last straw. This fanatical Catholic, educated by the Jesuits, made no secret of his intention to return the empire to the fold of the one true church. His motto, "Better to rule a desert than a country of heretics," clearly demonstrated his willingness to go all the way. When the Czech Protestants refused to recognize him as their king and elected Frederick V, Elector Palatine, conflict became inevitable. The viceroys thrown out of the window became merely a symbol of a schism that could no longer be healed with words. The roots of the 30 Years' War lay in the religious revolution that had divided the Christian world a century earlier. Martin Luther, by nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church in 1517, set in motion a process whose consequences exceeded even the wildest expectations. What began as a call for reform of church abuses turned into a total war for souls and territory. Protestantism in its various forms, Lutheranism, Calvinism, Anglicanism, challenged not only the spiritual, but also the political authority of the Catholic Church. The Pope lost the right to appoint bishops in Protestant lands, and, with it, the enormous income from church offices. Monastic lands, which accounted for up to a third of all holdings in some regions, were secularized and passed to secular rulers. The economic losses were estimated at millions of guilders annually. But it was not just about money. The Protestant doctrine that every believer could communicate directly with God undermined the entire hierarchical structure of medieval society. If a peasant was equal before God to a duke, on what basis should he unquestioningly obey secular authority? The Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525 in Germany showed what such ideas could lead to in practice. The Catholic Church responded with the Counter-Reformation, a large-scale program of internal renewal and the fight against heresy. The Council of Trent, which sat intermittently from 1545 to 1563, clearly formulated Catholic doctrine and condemned Protestant errors. The Inquisition was given new powers, and the Jesuit order became the striking force of the Catholic reaction. The situation was particularly acute in the Holy Roman Empire, where the emperors of the Habsburg dynasty formally remained Catholic, but were forced to reckon with the Protestant prince-electors. Charles V spent most of his reign fighting the Lutherans, but in the end was forced to compromise. The Augsburg Religious Peace of 1555 enshrined the principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose power, his religion. However, this compromise gave rise to new problems. What should be done if a prince converted to another faith? Should his subjects automatically follow him, or did they have the right to retain their former religion? And what about church lands? Could Protestant rulers secularize Catholic monasteries and bishoprics? These questions remained unanswered and created constant tension. The situation was complicated by the emergence of Calvinism, the third major Christian denomination. Calvinists were more radical than Lutherans and were not recognized by the Peace of Augsburg. They actively spread their faith in the Rhineland, Bohemia, and Hungary. The Elector Palatine became a Calvinist, which set a precedent. One of the 7 electors of the emperor was no longer Catholic or Lutheran. By the beginning of the 17th century, the religious map of the empire resembled a patchwork quilt. Bavaria and Austria remained strongholds of Catholicism, Saxony and Brandenburg professed Lutheranism, and the Palatinate adopted Calvinism. Small principalities and cities chose their faith depending on the political interests and personal convictions of their rulers. A traveler, after traveling 100 kilometers, could find himself in a country with a completely different religion. Religious intolerance permeated all spheres of life. Catholics and Protestants created parallel worlds, their own schools, universities, hospitals, and charitable organizations. Mixed marriages became rare and caused scandals. Merchants avoided cities where the wrong faith was practiced, fearing discrimination or open hostility. Relations were particularly dramatic in cities with mixed populations. In Augsburg, Catholics and Lutherans shared power on a parity basis, but were in constant conflict over church processions, bell ringing, and other religious rites. In Donauwörth, the Protestant majority banned a Catholic procession, leading to the intervention of the emperor and the occupation of the city by Bavarian troops. Such incidents multiplied with each passing year, creating an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and hatred. Ferdinand II, Habsburg ascended the imperial throne with one obsessive idea: to return the empire to the fold of the Catholic faith. This thin man with deep-set eyes and an ascetic face was educated in Jesuit colleges and firmly believed that God had chosen him for the sacred mission of eradicating heresy. "Better to rule a desert of Catholics than a garden of heretics," he liked to repeat, and these words were not empty rhetoric. Even as Archduke of Styria, Ferdinand showed what he was capable of in the name of faith. He expelled all Protestant preachers from his domains, closed their schools and churches, and forced the nobility to choose between Catholicism and emigration. Those who refused to change their faith were stripped of their estates and titles. During his 20 years of rule in Styria, not a single official Protestant remained. Europe watched this experiment in forced recatholization with horror. When Ferdinand became emperor in 1619, the Protestant princes realized that the same fate awaited them. The new ruler made no secret of his intentions to abolish the Augsburg religious peace and put an end to heretical freedom in the empire. He surrounded himself with fanatical Catholics, Jesuits, Bavarian advisors, and Spanish diplomats. Moderate voices at court were drowned out by the militant rhetoric of the Crusade. The first target of imperial recatholization was Bohemia, the richest and most populous Protestant kingdom in the empire. Here, the traditions of the Hussite Wars still lived on, when the Czechs fought for 100 years against the Catholic Church and imperial power. The local nobility had mostly converted to Lutheranism, or the more radical Calvinism, and Protestant schools and printing houses operated in Prague. Ferdinand began his offensive cautiously but purposefully. He appointed Catholics to key positions in the royal administration, despite protests from the estates. He then attempted to restrict the rights of Protestant churches, citing the need to restore order. When the Czech nobility complained that the new laws violated their traditional privileges, the emperor replied that the privileges of heretics had no power before the will of God. The issue of succession became particularly painful. The Czech crown was formally elective, but in practice had been inherited by the Habsburgs for more than a century. However, the estates now declared that they would not recognize Ferdinand's hereditary rights if he trampled on religious freedoms. The emperor took this as a direct challenge to his authority and began to prepare for a forceful resolution of the conflict. Ferdinand had the power of the entire Catholic world behind him. Pope Paul V blessed his crusade against heretics and promised financial support. King Philip III of Spain, the emperor's cousin, was ready to provide troops and money to fight Protestantism. The French Queen Mother, Marie de Medici, despite her complicated relationship with the Habsburgs, also supported the idea of recatholicization. But Ferdinand's most important ally was Maximilian I, Duke of Bavaria and head of the Catholic League. This energetic ruler managed to create a combat-ready army of 25,000 men and accumulate a military treasury of 2.5 million guilders. Maximilian dreamed of receiving the title of Elector in exchange for military assistance to the emperor, and Ferdinand was ready to agree to this deal. The emperor's plans were not limited to Bohemia. He intended to systematically conquer all Protestant territories of the empire, starting with the richest and most influential ones. After Bohemia, it was to be Saxony's turn, then Brandenburg and the North German principalities. Each victory would bring new resources for the next stage of the campaign. Special attention was paid to propaganda. The Jesuits flooded Germany with pamphlets arguing that Protestantism was not only a religious error, but also a political crime against the legitimate authorities. They claimed that heretics were by nature prone to rebellion and treason, so tolerance towards them was tantamount to condoning anarchy. The emperor was sincerely convinced of the righteousness of his cause. He saw himself as a new Charlemagne, uniting Europe under the banner of the true faith. Daily prayers and fasting were supposed to give him the strength to carry out God's will. Ferdinand believed that the Almighty would grant him victory over the heretics, just as he had once granted Constantine the great triumph over the pagans. This fanatical conviction made compromise impossible and doomed Europe to 30 years of bloodshed. The Bohemian Revolt began with a theatrical gesture, the defenestration of Prague, but quickly turned into a serious attempt to create an independent Protestant kingdom in the heart of Europe. The Czech estates, outraged by Ferdinand's religious policies, decided to take decisive action. They formed a provisional government of 30 directors, expelled Catholic officials, and began to form their own army. The rebels understood that they could not cope with the imperial power on their own, so they launched active diplomatic efforts. Czech ambassadors traveled to all the Protestant capitals of Europe, asking for military and financial assistance. Particular hopes were pinned on the Protestant Union, which was formally obliged to protect its members from Catholic aggression. However, reality turned out to be harsher than expected. The head of the Protestant Union, Frederick V, Elector Palatine, was a young and inexperienced ruler who was more interested in court entertainment than politics. He was nicknamed the Winter King because he reigned in Bohemia for only one winter. His English father-in-law, James I, despite his Protestant faith, did not want to quarrel with the powerful Habsburgs over distant Bohemia. The only real support the Czechs received came from the Transylvanian prince Gábor Bethlen, who attacked Hungary from the east, and from the Duke of Savoy, who attacked Austrian possessions in the Alps. But these allies pursued their own goals and were unable to coordinate their actions against the emperor. Military operations began in the summer of 1618. The Bohemian army, commanded by Count Thurn, marched on Vienna, hoping to capture the Habsburg capital in one swift blow. The campaign was successful. Cities opened their gates, and the population welcomed the liberators from Catholic rule. By October, Czech troops had reached the outskirts of Vienna and began a siege. Ferdinand's situation seemed desperate. He had no money, no army, and no reliable allies. The nobility of Upper and Lower Austria was ready to side with the rebels. Panic broke out in Vienna itself. The wealthy citizens were moving their property out of the city, while the poor openly sympathized with the Protestants. It seemed that the Habsburg dynasty was living out its last days. But the emperor did not give up. He pawned the family jewels to raise money for mercenaries, turned to the Pope and the Spanish king for help, and mobilized all the resources of his hereditary lands. Most importantly, he managed to form an alliance with the Bavarian Duke Maximilian, who agreed to provide the army of the Catholic League in exchange for the promise of land and the title of the rebellious Palatinate Elector. The siege of Vienna dragged on, and this proved to be a fatal mistake on the part of the Bohemian command. Instead of a decisive assault, Count Thurn hesitated, hoping for the city to surrender. Meanwhile, winter was approaching. Disease was spreading in the army, and the promised help from the Allies never arrived. In November, the Czechs were forced to lift the siege and retreat to Bohemia. This missed opportunity changed the entire course of the war. Ferdinand gained the respite he needed to mobilize his resources, while his opponents lost the strategic initiative. In the winter of 1618 to 1619, the emperor concluded a treaty with Maximilian of Bavaria and began preparations for a counteroffensive. In the spring of 1619, a united Catholic army under the command of Johann Cerclas Tilly invaded Bohemia. This experienced Flemish commander, who had served in the Spanish army for 30 years, quickly demonstrated his superiority over the amateur Czech commanders. One after another, Protestant cities fell, and peasants, exhausted by the requisitions of both armies, welcomed the Catholic soldiers as liberators. The decisive battle took place on November 8, 1620, at White Mountain near Prague. The Bohemian army, numbering about 21,000 men, took up an advantageous position on the dominant heights. The Catholic troops of Tilly and Bucquoy were outnumbered, with only 18,000 men, but they surpassed their opponents in combat experience and discipline. The battle lasted only 2 hours, but its outcome determined the fate of Central Europe for centuries to come. The Czech infantry, consisting mainly of militiamen and foreign mercenaries, could not withstand the onslaught of battle-hardened Catholic veterans. When the commander of the Bohemian troops was killed at the very beginning of the battle, panic broke out among the defenders. The army fell apart, leaving 4,000 dead and all its artillery on the battlefield. The Winter King, Frederick V, fled Prague so hastily that he did not have time to take the royal regalia with him. He was nicknamed the Fugitive from Bohemia, and mocking pamphlets spread throughout Europe the story of how the Protestant monarch left his crown in the clutches of the Catholic lions. The defeat at White Mountain was not just a military disaster, but a symbol of the collapse of Protestant hopes for independence from Habsburg rule. After crushing the Bohemian uprising, Ferdinand II unleashed a reign of terror aimed at completely eradicating Protestantism in the Habsburg hereditary lands. On June 27, 1621, 27 leaders of the uprising were executed in Prague's Old Town Square. Their heads were mounted on pikes and displayed on Charles Bridge as a warning to anyone who dared to oppose the emperor's will. But the mass executions were only the beginning. They were followed by the total confiscation of the property of Protestant nobles. About 600 noble families lost all their possessions, which were transferred to Catholic nobles or sold for a pittance to imperial officials. Entire villages changed hands like commodities on the market. The centuries-old landowning aristocracy of Bohemia was wiped off the face of the earth in a few years. The Protestant clergy was expelled, All pastors who refused to convert to Catholicism had to leave the country within 6 months. Protestant schools and printing houses were closed, and heretical books were burned. The famous Charles University in Prague, founded by Charles IV, was handed over to the Jesuits to re-educate young people in the spirit of the true faith. Mass emigration swept across Bohemia. According to various estimates, between 150,000 and 300,000 people left the country, almost a quarter of the entire population. Not only nobles and merchants left, but also craftsmen, peasants, and scientists. Along with them, entire industries disappeared. Glassmaking, weaving, metallurgy. Cities became deserted, fields overgrown with weeds. Among the emigrants was the great educator Jan Amos Comenius, known as the Teacher of Nations by his contemporaries. The last bishop of the Bohemian Brethren wandered around Europe, writing the famous words, "Will the rule of your affairs ever return to you, O perished Czech people?" His prophecy came true only 300 years later, after World War I. But religious terror in Bohemia was only a prelude to a new stage of the war. The victory at White Mountain so inspired the Catholic camp that Ferdinand decided to continue his crusade against heretics throughout the empire. The next target was the Palatinate, the ancestral lands of Frederick V, the Winter King, which the emperor declared confiscated for treason. The Palatinate was a tempting prize. This territory on the Rhine controlled the most important trade routes from central Germany to France and the Netherlands. Local industries, wine production, metallurgy, and textile manufacturing generated enormous revenues. In addition, the Palatinate elector was one of the 7 princes who elected the emperor, and depriving him of this right strengthened the position of Catholics in the College of Electors. The conquest of the Palatinate was entrusted to the Spanish general Ambrogio Spinola, one of the best commanders of his time. This aristocrat from Genoa became famous in battles against the Dutch and was considered invincible in the art of siege warfare. His army of 25,000 veterans quickly captured all the fortresses of the Palatinate without encountering serious resistance. At the same time, Catholic troops under the command of Tilly were operating in northern Germany, where they were trying to force the Protestant princes into submission. The Duke of Brunswick, Count Mansfeld, and other commanders of mercenary troops offered resistance, but their forces were scattered and poorly coordinated. One after another, the cities of Westphalia and Lower Saxony fell. The successes of the Catholic forces alarmed Protestant Europe. King Christian IV of Denmark, fearing for the fate of his possessions in northern Germany, decided to intervene in the conflict. This warlike monarch dreamed of expanding Danish possessions at the expense of the German principalities and counted on the support of England and Holland. In 1625, he invaded Germany at the head of an army of 20,000. Thus began a new phase of the 30 Years' War, the Danish period. Christian IV formally acted as a defender of the Protestant faith, but in reality, he pursued dynastic goals. He laid claim to the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, wanted to control the mouths of the Elbe and Weser rivers, and dreamed of the crown of the North German kingdom. The Danish intervention took the Catholics by surprise. Tilly was in southern Germany with his main forces, and Spanish troops were tied up in the war in the Netherlands. It seemed that the Protestants had been given a second chance to turn the tide of war in their favor. But Ferdinand II did not lose his composure and found an unexpected solution to the crisis. The emperor turned to Albrecht von Wallenstein, a Bohemian aristocrat who had amassed a huge fortune by confiscating the property of Protestants. This ambitious adventurer proposed to create a new imperial army at his own expense, hoping to recoup his costs through military spoils. Ferdinand agreed to this risky proposal, unaware that he was creating a future rival for himself. Wallenstein launched a recruitment campaign on an unprecedented scale. His agents scoured Europe, luring soldiers into the army with generous salaries and promises of easy money. In a few months, he assembled an army of 50,000, the largest Germany had ever seen. The war was entering a new, even bloodier phase. Albrecht Wenzel, Eusebius von Wallenstein, was a man who embodied the spirit of his era. Cruel, greedy, full of incredible opportunities for those who knew how to take advantage of them. Born into a poor Protestant family in Bohemia, he managed to become one of the richest men in Europe and create an army that kings feared. His life read like an adventure novel, full of dizzying rises and tragic falls. Wallenstein understood early on that in an era of religious wars, it was most profitable to be on the side of the victors. Born a Protestant, he converted to Catholicism for the sake of his career, married a wealthy widow, and began buying up the lands of ruined nobles. When the Bohemian uprising began, he prudently remained loyal to the emperor, and after the victory at White Mountain, he had the opportunity to participate in the division of confiscated property. Within a few years, Wallenstein became the largest landowner in Bohemia. He owned 240 estates, 6 cities, and many villages. Glassblowers, weavers, gunsmiths, and metallurgists worked on his lands. He created a virtually independent state within a state with its own laws, courts, and military garrisons. The income from this empire reached 6 million guilders a year, but landholdings were not enough for him. Wallenstein dreamed of military glory and political influence. He studied the works of ancient commanders, collected maps and plans of fortresses, and recruited experienced officers. When the emperor found himself in a difficult situation due to the Danish intervention, the Bohemian magnate saw his chance and did not miss it. In 1625, Wallenstein proposed to Ferdinand II that he create a new imperial army of 50,000 men at his own expense. In return, he demanded the title of Imperial Generalissimo and the right to maintain troops at the expense of the occupied territories. The emperor, having no other options, agreed to these unprecedented conditions. The system of war feeding war, invented by Wallenstein, revolutionized military affairs. Instead of paying soldiers from the state treasury, he forced the local population to maintain the army through a system of contributions. Each region had to supply a certain amount of food, fodder, clothing, and money. Those who could not pay with money paid in kind or with labor. Recruitment into Wallenstein's army proceeded at an unprecedented pace. His agents operated throughout Europe, luring soldiers with generous promises. Salaries were paid punctually, the food was plentiful, and the opportunities for looting were unlimited. Adventurers of all nations flocked to the army. Germans and Italians, Spaniards and Croats, Poles and Hungarians. Even the French and Dutch served under the banners of the Catholic Emperor. By the spring of 1626, Wallenstein had an army of 70,000 men at his disposal, the largest military force Europe had seen since the Roman Empire. This mass moved against the Danish king, spreading terror in its path. Cities surrendered without a fight, just to avoid being plundered. Peasants fled to the forests, abandoning their homes and livestock. The campaign against Christian IV progressed rapidly. The Danish army, inferior to its enemy in numbers and discipline, suffered defeat after defeat. In August 1626, Wallenstein's troops defeated the Danes at Lutter. The king himself barely escaped with his life, losing all his artillery and baggage train. After Lutter, Danish resistance practically ceased. Wallenstein occupied all of northern Germany, including Mecklenburg, Pomerania, and Schleswig-Holstein. His troops approached the very border of Denmark, threatening to invade the Jutland Peninsula. Christian IV requested peace, ready to give up all his conquests. But the Generalissimo's successes alarmed the emperor himself. Wallenstein behaved like an independent ruler. He concluded treaties with cities, appointed governors, and minted coins. He demanded the titles of Duke of Mecklenburg and Admiral of the Baltic Sea for himself. His letters to the emperor were full of poorly concealed threats and resembled ultimatums. Ferdinand was particularly concerned about Wallenstein's plans to create an imperial fleet in the Baltic. The Generalissimo dreamed of a naval war against Denmark and Sweden, hoping to undermine their trade and capture lucrative markets. He had already begun building shipyards in Wismar and other ports, inviting Dutch shipbuilders and naval officers. Wallenstein's growing power frightened not only the emperor, but also other German princes. The Catholic League, led by Maximilian of Bavaria, saw him as a dangerous competitor who could overshadow their achievements. Protestant rulers feared that after the defeat of Denmark, it would be their turn. Even the emperor's allies demanded that the Generalissimo's excessive ambitions be curbed. The pressure on Ferdinand intensified. At the Reichstag in Regensburg in 1627, the electors demanded that Wallenstein's army be disbanded as a threat to the traditional freedoms of the empire. The Pope complained about the Generalissimo's excessive independence in church matters. The King of Spain feared that Wallenstein might interfere with his plans in the Netherlands. Despite the discontent, the emperor did not yet dare to break with Wallenstein. The Generalissimo's army was the only force capable of countering the growing threats from all sides. France was preparing for war with the Habsburgs, Sweden was assembling a fleet to invade Germany, and the Turks were threatening Hungary. In such a situation, it would be madness to lose the services of the best commander of the era. When the Swedish king Gustav II Adolf landed in Pomerania in the summer of 1630, few people imagined that this tall blond man with a bushy mustache would radically change the course of the 30 Years' War. The Habsburgs and their allies regarded the appearance of yet another Protestant adventurer as an insignificant episode. They were sorely mistaken. A military genius had entered Germany who, in 2 years, would reduce the mighty empire to ruins. Gustavus Adolphus was no ordinary adventurous king. This 36-year-old monarch had already spent 18 years on the throne, 16 of which he spent fighting Russia, Denmark, and Poland. He created the most modern army in Europe, based on the latest principles of military art. Swedish soldiers were better trained, armed, and organized than any other troops of the time. Gustavus Adolphus's military reforms revolutionized tactics. He reduced the depth of battle formations from 10 rows to 6, increasing the front line of fire. His musketeers used lighter guns and pre-made cartridges, which tripled their rate of fire. Artillery became more mobile thanks to light 3-pound cannons that could follow the infantry directly into battle. A distinctive feature of the Swedish army was its strict discipline. Gustavus Adolphus forbade soldiers from looting churches, raping women, or killing prisoners. Violation of military regulations was punishable by death. Such orders seemed unthinkable in an era when armies lived exclusively by plunder. But the result exceeded expectations. The Swedes gained the support of the local population, who saw them as liberators. Gustavus Adolphus landed in Germany with an army of only 13,000 men. But his plans were grandiose. He hoped to create a great northern coalition against the Habsburgs, uniting Sweden, France, the Protestant princes of Germany, and even Orthodox Russia. The Baltic Sea was to become a Swedish lake, and the king himself was to become the hegemon of Northern Europe. At first, things were difficult. German Protestants were afraid to get involved with yet another foreign adventurer, remembering the sad fate of the Danish king Christian IV. The Elector of Brandenburg and the Duke of Saxony took a wait-and-see position, demanding concrete guarantees from the Swedes. French subsidies were irregular, and the promised support of the fleet never materialized. Meanwhile, the imperial troops under the command of Tilly were preparing to attack the Swedish bridgehead. Despite being 70 years old, the old Flemish commander retained his reputation as an invincible military leader. His army of 36,000 men significantly outnumbered the Swedish forces and had a huge advantage in experience. But Gustavus Adolphus had no intention of waiting passively for the attack. In the spring of 1631, he went on the offensive, delivering swift blows to the enemy's scattered garrisons. One after another, Frankfurt an der Oder, Landsberg, and Demmin fell. The Swedish tactic of small-scale warfare demoralized the imperial troops, who were accustomed to traditional sieges and large battles. The decisive moment came in May 1631, when Tilly laid siege to the Protestant city of Magdeburg. This wealthy trading center on the Elbe was the key to northern Germany. Its fall would open the way to the Baltic Sea and cut off the Swedes from their supply bases. Gustavus Adolphus understood the importance of Magdeburg, but did not manage to come to the aid of the besieged. On May 20th, 1631, Tilly's troops stormed the city. What happened next shocked all of Europe. The soldiers, embittered by the stubborn resistance, carried out a massacre, sparing neither women, children, nor the elderly. The city was burned to the ground, and only 5,000 of its 30,000 inhabitants survived. The Magdeburg wedding, as Catholics sarcastically called this massacre, became a symbol of the horrors of war. The destruction of Magdeburg had the opposite effect to that intended. Instead of intimidating the Protestants, it ignited their thirst for revenge. The Saxon elector and the Margrave of Brandenburg finally decided to form an alliance with Sweden. Gustavus Adolphus received the long-awaited opportunity to increase his army at the expense of the German militias and continue the offensive. The first major battle between the Swedes and the imperial forces took place on September 17, 1631, at Breitenfeld, near Leipzig. Tilly had superiority in numbers, 40,000 against 39,000 for the Allies, but Gustavus Adolphus surpassed him in tactics and maneuverability. The battle lasted several hours and ended in the complete defeat of the imperial troops. The old military system collapsed under the blows of Swedish innovations. The victory at Breitenfeld opened the way for the Swedish army to the very heart of the empire. Gustavus Adolphus was faced with a strategic choice: to march east against Austria or west against the Catholic principalities of the Rhine. The king chose the latter, hoping to gain the support of France and cut off Spanish communications between Italy and the Netherlands. This decision determined the further course of the war. French diplomacy played a subtle and cunning game. Cardinal Richelieu, the de facto ruler of France under the feeble-minded King Louis XIII, formally remained a Catholic, but secretly supported the Protestants against the Habsburgs. His principle was to weaken France's main rival by any means necessary. "Heretical Swedes are better than Catholic Spaniards," the Iron Cardinal told his entourage. French subsidies allowed Gustavus Adolphus to significantly increase his army. By the beginning of 1632, 80,000 men were fighting under his banners: Swedes, Germans, Finns, Scots, and French. It was truly a European army, united by hatred of Habsburg hegemony. Salaries were paid regularly, discipline was strictly maintained, and morale was at its highest. The Swedish offensive in the Rhinelands developed rapidly. One after another, Würzburg, Aschaffenburg, and Mainz surrendered. Catholic bishops fled in panic, leaving behind full treasuries and wine cellars. The population welcomed the Swedes as liberators from Catholic oppression and imperial taxes. It seemed that the empire was collapsing like a house of cards. The capture of Mainz, the residence of one of the spiritual electors, was a particularly heavy blow. This city controlled the crossings over the Rhine and was the key to southern Germany. The Swedes seized huge stocks of weapons, food, and money there. The Archbishop of Mainz, one of the pillars of the Catholic party, humbly begged for peace from the heretical king. The successes of the Swedish army alarmed not only their enemies, but also their allies. Richelieu feared that Gustavus Adolphus would become too powerful and replace Habsburg hegemony with Swedish hegemony. The Protestant princes of Germany also did not want to replace one master with another. Secret negotiations began on how to curb the excessive ambitions of the Northern Lion. Meanwhile, Emperor Ferdinand II, in desperation, turned to the only man capable of saving the empire from disaster. Wallenstein, dismissed in 1630 under pressure from his detractors, was in his Bohemian estates, watching the defeats of his former rivals with a smirk. Now he agreed to return, but on his own terms. The new agreement with Wallenstein was even more onerous for the emperor than the previous one. The Generalissimo received virtually unlimited power, the right to conclude truces, confiscate property, and appoint governors. He could dispose of all the empire's resources for waging war, and was accountable only to the emperor. In fact, Wallenstein became a dictator with extraordinary powers. Within a few months, Wallenstein had assembled a new army of 40,000 men. His magical name once again attracted thousands of adventurers from all over Europe. He obtained money for the war through ruthless contributions from the population. "War must feed war," the Generalissimo repeated, squeezing the last juices out of a ruined Germany. In the spring of 1632, the two greatest armies of the era moved towards each other. Gustavus Adolphus and his allies marched south from Mainz, intending to join forces with the French troops in Alsace. Wallenstein and the imperial army hurried to intercept the Swedes and give them a decisive battle. The encounter took place on November 16, 1632, near the village of Lutzen in Saxony. Both commanders understood that the fate of Germany and all of Europe depended on the outcome of the battle. Gustavus Adolphus had 18,000 Swedes and allies at his disposal, while Wallenstein had roughly the same number of troops. The quality of the troops was roughly equal, so tactics would be the deciding factor. The battle began in the early morning fog. The Swedes attacked first, trying to use their superior maneuverability. Wallenstein met them with dense volleys from his musketeers and artillery fire. The battle was extremely bloody. Both sides suffered huge losses, but neither wanted to retreat. In the heat of battle, Gustavus Adolphus, who was personally leading a cavalry attack, was mortally wounded. The Lion of the North died on the battlefield in the prime of his life and glory. The news of the king's death initially demoralized the Swedes, but then ignited their thirst for revenge. They attacked with redoubled fury, shouting, "The king is dead! God lives!" Wallenstein was forced to retreat, leaving the battlefield to the enemy. Lutzen became a Pyrrhic victory for the Protestants. They achieved tactical success, but lost their brilliant leader. Without Gustavus Adolphus, the Swedish army lost its offensive momentum and switched to defense. The initiative in the war once again fell to the Catholics, but they too were too weakened to take advantage of it. Germany plunged into chaos and mutual destruction. After Lutzen, the war lost all traces of civility and turned into a merciless mutual destruction. The death of Gustavus Adolphus deprived the conflict of its last remnants of chivalry and nobility. The armies turned into bands of marauders, for whom looting and violence became the norm. Germany was plunging into an abyss of chaos, from which there was no visible way out. Famine followed in the army's footsteps. Soldiers requisitioned all food supplies, leaving the peasants without even seed grain. The fields lay fallow, as there was no one to work them. The men were taken away to serve as soldiers, or killed as potential enemies. Livestock was stolen for the needs of the armies, and barns were completely emptied. By 1633, entire regions had been depopulated by famine. The fate of Württemberg was particularly dire. This once flourishing land had turned into a scorched desert. Of the 400,000 inhabitants, less than 100,000 remained alive. Villages stood empty. Cities were reduced to ruins. Travelers told horrific stories of people eating tree bark, shoe leather, and in extreme cases, the corpses of their loved ones. Plague followed famine like a faithful companion. Weakened by malnutrition, people became easy prey for disease. Epidemics broke out one after another, wiping out entire cities. In Augsburg, the population fell from 40,000 to 18,000. Munich lost a third of its inhabitants, and Nuremberg lost half. Medical care was virtually non-existent. Doctors died alongside commoners, and hospitals became breeding grounds for infection. People died right on the streets, and there was no one to remove the corpses. Dogs and pigs devoured the dead bodies, spreading the infection even further. Cities turned into giant open-air cemeteries. Looting reached unprecedented levels. Soldiers robbed not only their enemies, but also their allies. Not only the rich, but also the poor. They broke into churches, tore gold frames from icons, and melted sacred vessels into coins. Monasteries were razed to the ground. Libraries were burned for kindling, and works of art were sold for a pittance or simply destroyed. The Croatian and Hungarian units of the Imperial Army were particularly cruel. These nomadic warriors showed no mercy to anyone. They turned looting into an art form, devising sophisticated tortures to extract money from their victims. The Swedish drink, pouring boiling water down the throat, became their signature method of forcing people to reveal their hidden treasures. Protestants were not far behind the Catholics. Swedish troops, left without firm command after the king's death, also indulged in looting. French, Dutch, and English mercenaries in their ranks turned the war into a source of easy money. Discipline finally collapsed, and officers lost control of their subordinates. Peasants tried to defend themselves against looters by forming armed self-defense units. They built fortifications in the forests, hid food in secret caches, and attacked small groups of soldiers. But this was an unequal struggle. Professional soldiers easily dealt with poorly armed farmers. Every act of resistance was met with brutal repression. Cities tried to buy their way out of trouble with the armies by paying huge contributions, but there was still not enough money. Soldiers had to be paid, weapons had to be bought, and supply trains had to be maintained. Every passing army demanded more and more payments. City coffers were emptied, artisans were ruined, and trade came to a standstill. The free imperial cities suffered particularly hard. These once rich trading centers were a tempting target for any army. Frankfurt am Main paid contributions to the Swedes, the French, and the imperial forces at the same time. Cologne closed its gates and withstood sieges, spending its last funds on defense. Hamburg was saved only by its distance from the main theaters of war. The system of law and order collapsed completely. The courts did not function, the police did not exist, and local authorities either fled or were killed. Everyone survived as best they could, without hoping for anyone's protection. Banditry flourished. Deserters from the armies formed robber bands and terrorized the countryside. The social structure of society was crumbling before our eyes. The nobility became impoverished and turned into soldiers of fortune or bandits. Peasants abandoned their land and fled to the forests or cities. Craftsmen lost their customers and clients. Priests left their parishes or perished along with their flocks. Germany was returning to a state of primitive chaos. Intellectual life came to a standstill. Schools and universities closed. Books were used as fuel, and scholars died or emigrated. An entire generation grew up in wartime, knowing neither literacy, nor crafts, nor normal human life. The cultural damage was no less severe than the material damage. Germany's economic collapse in the mid-1630s was unprecedented in European history. A country that had recently been a thriving center of trade and crafts turned into a scorched desert where primitive barter reigned supreme. The monetary system collapsed, cities were depopulated, and trade routes were overgrown with grass. The economy degraded to the level of a natural economy. Trade, which had been the basis of the prosperity of German cities, practically ceased. The Hanseatic League, once a powerful merchant league, finally collapsed. Its ships rotted in ports or were captured by pirates. Trading houses that had accumulated wealth for centuries went bankrupt in a matter of years. Merchants either died or fled to safer countries. Southern German financial centers were particularly hard hit. The Fugger family of Augsburg bankers, who had once lent money to emperors and kings, went completely bankrupt. Their offices in various countries closed one after another, and their debts proved irrecoverable. The Nuremberg moneylenders and money changers also lost all their savings. Centuries-old financial traditions were destroyed in a single generation. Craft production declined catastrophically. Guilds disintegrated, masters died or emigrated, and apprentices became soldiers or vagrants. Production secrets, passed down from generation to generation, were lost forever. The famous Nuremberg clocks, Augsburg silver, and Cologne fabrics disappeared from European markets. Agriculture was in complete ruin. Fields were turned into pastures for army horses or overgrown with forest. Peasants, if they survived, grew only what was necessary to feed their families. Commercial agriculture did not exist. There was no one to sell the harvest to, and no money to buy it. Entire regions returned to a state of wilderness. The consequences for livestock farming were particularly catastrophic. The armies requisitioned all livestock: cows for meat, horses for cavalry, sheep for wool. Purebred animals, bred by generations of peasants, were eaten in a matter of days. Restoring the livestock population would have required decades of peaceful life, which did not exist. The empire's transport system was completely destroyed. Roads became unsafe due to robbers and deserters. Bridges were blown up by retreating armies, and inns were reduced to ruins. Travel between cities became a deadly undertaking. Postal services ceased, and information was transmitted only by chance travelers. River trade, which had once brought in huge profits, came to a standstill. The Rhine, Elbe, and Danube rivers turned into military frontiers where opposing armies fought constantly. Merchant ships were captured as trophies. Cargoes were confiscated, and crews were killed or enslaved. River ports were deserted, shipyards closed. Urban life deteriorated to medieval levels. Waterworks and sewage systems did not work, streets were not cleaned, and there was no one to extinguish fires. Craft quarters turned into slums where refugees and beggars huddled. Market squares, once bustling with trade, were overgrown with weeds. The city walls were falling into ruin without repair. Taxation became robbery. Various armies imposed contributions on the population arbitrarily, without any system. The same village could pay simultaneously to the Swedes, French, Bavarians, and imperial forces. Tax collectors turned into bandits with official powers. No one kept track of income and expenses. The monetary system collapsed under the weight of military spending. Princes minted coins from increasingly cheaper metals, reducing the silver content to a minimum. The Kipper inflation of the 1620s devalued money tenfold. People refused to accept the official currency, preferring barter or foreign coins. The credit system disappeared completely. Banks closed, loans were not issued, and bills of exchange were not paid. Savings that had been accumulated over generations evaporated in a few years. Old debt obligations became worthless pieces of paper. Trust in financial institutions was undermined for centuries. Foreign trade was reduced to a minimum. German goods disappeared from European markets, replaced by Dutch, English, and French goods. The trade balance became sharply negative. The empire could offer the world only mercenary soldiers and plundered treasures. Gold and silver flowed out to other countries. Technical progress came to a halt. Inventions ceased. New technologies were not introduced, and old knowledge was lost. Germany, once the center of scientific and technical thought, became a backward outskirt of Europe. It took almost a century after the end of the war to restore the technological level. Social mobility disappeared. The sons of craftsmen could not master their fathers' trades, and peasant children had no chance of rising in society. Society was frozen in a state of chaos, where the only way to rise was through military service. The educated middle class, the backbone of civilization, was virtually destroyed. The demographic catastrophe that befell Germany during the 30 Years' War was unprecedented in European history. According to various estimates, the population of the empire fell from 20 million to 7 or 8 million. A third of the inhabitants disappeared from the face of the earth during 30 years of continuous bloodshed. Some regions were almost completely depopulated and only recovered their pre-war population in the 18th century. The southern lands of the empire, Bavaria, Württemberg, Swabia, suffered the greatest losses. Military operations were particularly intense here, and the fertile lands attracted armies like a magnet. In Württemberg, of the 450,000 inhabitants, less than 100,000 remained by the end of the war. Entire regions were turned into deserts, where one could travel for dozens of kilometers without encountering a single living soul. Bavaria, a stronghold of Catholicism, also suffered terribly. The population of the duchy was reduced by half, despite the fact that it was formally on the side of the victors. The war spared neither allies nor enemies. The armies plundered everyone indiscriminately. Munich lost a third of its inhabitants, and some small towns disappeared from the map completely. The Protestant lands of northern Germany suffered no less. Mecklenburg was depopulated by almost half, and Pomerania lost 2/3 of its population. Here, the horrors of war were compounded by epidemics of plague that wiped out entire cities. Stralsund, Greifswald, and Stettin turned into ghost towns with empty houses and overgrown streets. The fate of the peasantry was particularly tragic. Rural residents made up 90% of the empire's population and bore the brunt of military levies. They were killed as potential enemies, enslaved, and starved by requisitions. Many left their homes and fled to cities or neighboring countries. Entire villages stood empty for years. Cities lost residents not only because of military operations, but also as a result of economic decline. Craftsmen and merchants emigrated in search of a better life. Augsburg lost more than half of its population. Nuremberg lost a third. And even Hamburg, far from the military operations, lost a quarter of its residents due to the cessation of trade. Emigration became widespread. Protestants fled Catholic persecution. Catholics fled Protestant persecution. The rich saved their capital. The poor sought their daily bread. According to various estimates, between 2 and 4 million people left the empire. They went to Holland and England, Denmark and Sweden, Poland and Hungary, and even to distant America. Among the emigrants were the best representatives of the German nation: scientists, artists, craftsmen, and merchants. Their knowledge and skills enriched other countries, but impoverished their homeland. Holland and England gained thousands of skilled craftsmen who contributed to their industrial development. Germany, on the other hand, lost skilled workers for generations to come. The birth rate fell dramatically. In the conditions of constant war, people were afraid to have children. There were fewer and fewer men of draft age, as many died in battle or from disease. Women often became widows at a young age and could not find new husbands. An entire generation of children was never born. Infant mortality reached monstrous proportions. In conditions of famine and unsanitary conditions, only the strongest infants survived. Orphanages were overflowing with homeless children who had no one to feed and raise them. Many children died in the first years of life from malnutrition and disease. Those who survived often remained physically and mentally underdeveloped. The structure of the population changed radically. The educated middle class, the foundation of civilized society, disappeared. The nobility was ruined or emigrated. The clergy suffered enormous losses. Most of those who survived were peasants and the urban poor, people accustomed to a hard life and able to survive in extreme conditions. The age structure was also distorted. There were catastrophically few men of draft age. Most had died in battle. Women, children, and the elderly predominated. This created additional problems for economic recovery. There was a shortage of workers for the most difficult jobs. Marriage became rare due to the shortage of men. Many women remained unmarried for life or married elderly or disabled men. Polygamy, formally prohibited by the church, was practiced in reality. One man supported several women with children. The traditional family as a social institution was destroyed. The linguistic map of the empire also changed. Many areas that had lost their indigenous population were settled by migrants from other regions or foreigners. In Bohemia, the Czech language was displaced by German. Dutch colonists settled in Pomerania. Dialect differences were erased due to the constant mixing of refugee flows. Cultural traditions were interrupted. The generation that grew up in wartime did not receive a normal education and upbringing. Children did not know their native folklore, could not read or write, and did not master the crafts of their ancestors. The connection between the past and the present was severed, and it had to be re-established after the war ended. Psychological trauma affected entire nations. People who had lived through 30 years of horror passed on their fears to their children and grandchildren. Distrust of authority, religious intolerance, and a propensity for violence became characteristic features of the post-war generations. It took centuries to heal the spiritual wounds of the 30 Years' War. The social upheavals of the 30 Years' War destroyed the centuries-old foundations of German society and gave rise to chaos bordering on anarchy. The traditional feudal hierarchy collapsed under the blows of military disasters. Nobles turned into robbers. Peasants abandoned their land and became soldiers of fortune, and priests traded in weapons. Society broke down into warring factions, each fighting for survival by any means necessary. Peasant uprisings broke out across the empire with unprecedented force. Exhausted by taxes and requisitions, farmers took up arms, seeing no other way out of their situation. In Upper Austria, peasants formed their own military units and controlled entire regions for several years. They expelled the nobles, divided their lands, and set up people's courts to deal with the oppressors. A particularly powerful uprising broke out in Swabia in 1633. Led by the shoemaker Hans Müller, the peasants captured several towns and proclaimed the creation of a Christian republic. They demanded the abolition of serfdom, the return of communal lands, and fair trials. The uprising lasted 2 years until it was suppressed by the combined forces of Catholic and Protestant troops. In Tyrol, the mountain dwellers, led by peasant leader Urban Sagstetter, created a virtually independent state. They controlled the mountain passes, collected customs duties, and minted their own coins. Their troops fought successfully against regular troops, using their knowledge of the terrain and the support of the population. Only the betrayal of one of their comrades led to the defeat of the uprising. Urban riots were no less dangerous for the authorities. The urban poor, driven to despair by hunger and extortion, rose up against the patriciate. In Frankfurt am Main, artisans seized the town hall and proclaimed popular rule. In Cologne, the rebels looted the houses of wealthy merchants and expelled the city council. The magistrates fled to the protection of the army, leaving the city to its fate. Religious fanaticism reached extreme forms. Sects appeared that preached the imminent end of the world and called for the destruction of all infidels. The Anabaptists in Münster attempted to create a heavenly kingdom on earth, where all property was shared and polygamy was considered a godly deed. Their commune lasted a year until it was crushed by the combined forces of Catholics and Lutherans. Desertion became widespread. Soldiers fled from the armies in entire regiments, unable to endure the hardships of military life. Many joined bandit gangs and terrorized the surrounding area. Italian and Croatian mercenaries, for whom looting was a common occupation, were particularly dangerous. They created veritable bandit kingdoms in the forests and mountains. Women were forced to take on male roles. Many widowed peasant women worked the fields themselves, while female merchants defended their shops with weapons in their hands. Female military leaders appeared, such as the famous Black Lisbeth from Swabia, who commanded a detachment of 200 horsemen. Traditional gender roles were blurred under the pressure of circumstances. Children who grew up in conditions of constant war did not know peaceful life. Many became soldiers at the age of 10 or 12, while others resorted to begging and theft. Gangs of street children roamed the cities, looting and killing. Juvenile crime reached unprecedented levels. An entire generation was morally crippled by the war. The educated elite of society had virtually disappeared. Universities were closed. Professors had died or emigrated, and students had gone off to war. The legal system collapsed. There were no judges, no lawyers, no notaries. Medicine degenerated to the level of folk healing. Scientific research ceased for decades. The moral foundations of society were completely undermined. In the struggle for survival, people forgot about honor, conscience, and humanity. Betrayal became the norm. Oaths were broken without remorse, and relatives sold each other for a handful of grain. The war corrupted souls no less than it ruined the country. Language became coarse and harsh. Hundreds of new swear words and curses appeared in everyday speech. Literature was filled with descriptions of violence and cruelty. Folk songs glorified robbers and murderers. Culture degenerated, reflecting the moral decline of society. Superstition flourished in an atmosphere of chaos and hopelessness. People sought explanations for their misfortunes in witchcraft and devilish plots. Witch hunts took on unprecedented proportions. Thousands of people suspected of witchcraft were burned. In Bavaria, about 1,000 witches, mostly elderly women and children, were executed in 10 years. Traditional holidays and rituals were forgotten or took on a gloomy character. Weddings turned into memorial services for the dead, and christenings into lamentations for the future of infants. Carnivals became like dances of death. Even religious services were filled with curses against enemies and pleas for revenge. Solidarity between social classes disappeared. The nobility despised the peasants as cattle, and the peasants hated their lords as bloodsuckers. The city patricians were at odds with the artisans, and the artisans with the day laborers. Society broke down into hostile atoms incapable of cooperation. Germany turned into a battlefield where everyone fought against everyone else. By the mid-1630s, the warring parties had reached a critical level of exhaustion. Even the most fanatical supporters of continuing the war understood that Germany could not withstand another decade of bloodshed. The first serious attempts to conclude peace were made as early as 1635, but they all failed due to mutual claims and religious intolerance on the part of the warring parties. The initiative for peace talks came from Pope Urban VIII, who was horrified to discover that Catholic France was at war with the Catholic Habsburgs in alliance with Protestant heretics. This situation contradicted all the canons of church policy and threatened to discredit the papacy once and for all. The pontiff offered his services as a mediator and even allocated funds for the organization of a peace congress. The first negotiations began in Cologne in 1636. Representatives of all interested parties gathered in this neutral city in the hope of finding a compromise solution. But already at the stage of discussing procedural issues, insurmountable contradictions emerged. Catholics demanded the restoration of the religious status quo of 1618, while Protestants insisted on preserving all their gains. Territorial disputes were particularly acute. Sweden claimed the entire Baltic coast of Germany, while France wanted Alsace and Lorraine. Bavaria demanded to retain the Palatinate and the electoral dignity, while the legitimate Palatinate elector insisted on the full restoration of his rights. Each side made maximum demands, unwilling to make concessions. The negotiations were complicated by the intervention of third countries. Spain feared the strengthening of France and secretly supported the emperor's uncompromising position. England, on the contrary, encouraged the Protestants to continue the struggle, promising financial assistance. The Dutch Republic saw the war as an opportunity to finally free itself from Spanish rule. The religious question remained a stumbling block. The Catholic side demanded the return of all church lands secularized after 1552. The Protestants categorically refused to part with the sources of income on which their economy depended. There were even disputes about which churches representatives of different denominations could worship in. Negotiations in Cologne reached an impasse by the fall of 1636. The delegates dispersed, accusing each other of unwillingness to compromise.